The room went silent the moment Damian Blackthorne raised his hand and pointed at his own wife in front of 5 packs. Alena Whitmore stood frozen at the center of the grand hall, her white dress catching the candlelight, her chin lifted even as her heart cracked open in front of hundreds of strangers. Damian's voice boomed through the marble hall, echoing off the high stone arches. "She has failed to give this pack an heir," he said, his eyes cold, his jaw tight with a fury that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the moment itself. 3 years, and nothing. I have decided. I will not keep a Luna who cannot secure our future." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Alphas from neighboring territories exchanged glances. A woman near the front covered her mouth. Alena felt every eye in the room settle on her like a weight pressing down on her chest, but she did not cry. She would not give him that. Beside Damian stood Serafina Voss, daughter of the Ashwood Park's Alpha, her lips curled into a small, satisfied smile that she tried and failed to hide. Alena caught it. She understood, in that single second, that this humiliation had been planned, rehearsed, perhaps even celebrated in whispered conversations behind closed doors. "I am considering setting her aside," Damian continued, his voice carrying no hesitation, no softness, nothing that resembled the man she thought she had married. "For a Luna who can properly serve this pack." Elena's hands trembled at her sides, but she pressed them flat against her dress and forced them still. She thought of the nights she had stayed awake beside him when nightmares of his father's death gripped him. She thought of the mornings she had risen before dawn to settle disputes between quarreling wolves so he would not have to. She thought of the winter 2 years ago when sickness swept through the park, and how she had given so much of her own strength to the healing rituals that her body had never fully recovered. He did not know that. She had never told him. She had wanted to protect him from worry, and this was the reward for her silence. She looked at him now, this man who had once promised to stand beside her through every season of their lives, and she saw only a stranger wearing a familiar face. Slowly, deliberately, Alena reached for the pendant resting against her collarbone. It was a moonstone, pale and glowing faintly even in the golden light of the hall, set in silver that had been in the Blackthorne family for generations. Damian had placed it around her neck on the night of their bonding ceremony, whispering that it would bind her soul to his, that as long as she wore it, she would never walk alone. She unclasped it now, her fingers steady despite the storm inside her. The hall seemed to hold its breath. Alena walked toward Damian, her steps unhurried, her eyes never leaving his. She stopped in front of him, close enough that only he could hear her voice, though every wolf in the room could smell the sharp scent of her sorrow and her resolve mixing together in the air. "You wanted a Luna who serves the pack," she said quietly. "I gave you 3 years of exactly that. But a king who humiliates his queen in front of the world she has protected does not deserve to be followed by anyone." She placed the pendant in his open palm and closed his fingers around it herself. Then she turned and walked toward the doors of the hall, her back straight, her steps unwavering, while whispers erupted behind her like a wave breaking against rock. Damian stood frozen, the pendant burning cold and heavy in his hand. He had expected her to beg. He had expected tears, pleading, some final attempt to hold on to her position. He had not expected silence. He had not expected her to simply leave. Serafina touched his arm gently, murmuring something about how strong he had been, how necessary this moment was for the pack's future. Damian barely heard her. His eyes were fixed on the doors Alena had just walked through, and something inside him, something buried under years of pressure and pride, twisted painfully in his chest. Outside, the cold night air hit Alena like a slap, but it felt clean compared to the poison of that hall. She did not stop walking. She did not look back at the towering pack house that had been her home, her prison, her battlefield for 3 years. She walked past the guards at the gate, who exchanged uncertain looks but did not dare stop her, not with the look in her eyes. By the time she reached the edge of the territory, tears finally slipped down her cheeks, but she did not slow her pace. She had given that pack everything she had. She had given Damian everything she had. And in one careless, cruel speech in front of the world, he had decided none of it mattered. Alena did not know where she would go next. She only knew she could not stay in a place where her worth was measured by a single failure that was never truly hers to carry alone. She wrapped her cloak tighter around her shoulders and walked into the darkness beyond the border, leaving behind the crown, the title, and the man who had just shattered whatever remained of the life she had built. Behind her, deep in the pack house, Damien finally looked down at the pendant in his hand. The moonstone had gone dark, its faint glow extinguished the moment Alena passed beyond the territory line. He stared at it for a long moment, a cold, sinking feeling settling into his stomach, though he could not yet understand why. He told himself he had done what needed to be done. He told himself the elders had been pressuring him for years, that a pack without an heir was a pack without a future, that Seraphina's family alliance would strengthen their borders against the growing threats from the north. But standing there, in the sudden quiet of the hall, surrounded by whispers he refused to meet with his eyes, Damien felt, for the first time since he had taken the throne from his father, that he had made a mistake he could not undo with strength or command or title. He closed his fist around the cold stone and said nothing more that night. Alena traveled through the night without stopping, moving instinctively toward the one place she knew she might still be welcome, a small cottage on the edge of the neutral territory known as the Wildwood, where her Aunt Margaret had lived quietly for the past decade after stepping down as head healer of the Blackthorn Pack. The journey took most of 2 days. Alena moved carefully, avoiding the main roads where pack scouts might recognize her, sleeping in short stretches beneath the shelter of old oak trees, drinking from cold streams, eating little because her stomach twisted too tightly for hunger to matter. Her wolf stayed close beneath her skin, quiet and subdued, as though it too understood that something fundamental had broken and needed time before it could be spoken of, let alone healed. When she finally reached the cottage, exhaustion had hollowed out her eyes and her steps had slowed to something barely more than stumbling. Margaret opened the door before Alena even reached it, alerted by some instinct only an aunt seemed to possess, and the older woman's face crumpled with worry the moment she saw the state of her niece. "Alena," she breathed, pulling her inside without a single question, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, guiding her to sit by the fire that already crackled warmly in the hearth. "What happened?" It took a long while before Alena could speak without her voice breaking. She told her aunt everything, the humiliation in the hall, the pendant she had returned, the cold satisfaction on Seraphina's face, the years of quiet sacrifice Damien had never noticed or asked about. Margaret listened without interrupting, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of tea she never drank, her eyes growing darker with anger the longer Alena spoke. When Alena finally finished, silence settled between them, broken only by the crackling fire and the wind pressing gently against the cottage windows. "You did the right thing," Margaret said finally. "No one, not even an alpha king, has the right to strip someone's dignity in front of others and call it leadership." Alena wiped her eyes, though fresh tears kept coming despite her efforts. "I gave him everything, Aunt Margaret. I gave the pack everything. And in front of everyone, he made it sound like I had done nothing at all." Margaret reached over and took her niece's hand firmly. "Then you will rest here, and you will heal, and you will remember who you are outside of that crown and outside of that man's judgment. You were Alena long before you were Luna. You will be Alena again." The days that followed blurred together in a haze of quiet mornings and long, aching nights. Alena helped her aunt tend to the small garden behind the cottage, gathering herbs used for communities and healing salves, the same skills Alena herself had learned as a young woman before she had ever imagined becoming Luna of a powerful pack. The work was simple, repetitive, and strangely soothing. It gave her hands something to do while her mind slowly began sorting through the wreckage of the life she had left behind. At night, she often sat by the small window overlooking the forest, watching the moon rise and fall, remembering the way it used to feel comforting rather than cold. She thought about the early years of her marriage, when Damien had still looked at her with warmth, when he still sought her advice before making decisions, when he still reached for her hand instinctively rather than treating her presence as an afterthought. She wondered when exactly things had shifted. Perhaps it had been gradual, so gradual she had not noticed the warmth fading until it had disappeared entirely, replaced by distance, obligation, and finally, that final act of public cruelty. Meanwhile, far from the Wildwood, the Blackthorn Pack was beginning to feel the absence of its Luna in ways no one had anticipated. The morning after Elena's departure, disputes that would normally have been settled quietly and quickly began escalating instead. Two young wolves who had once respected Elena's calm judgment in matters of territory and courtship now argued loudly in the training grounds, with no one stepping in to mediate before tempers flared dangerously close to violence. The pack's beta, a steady and loyal wolf named Colin, found himself overwhelmed trying to manage responsibilities that Alena had quietly handled for years without anyone fully realizing the scope of her contributions. Elders who had once supported Damien's decision now began murmuring among themselves, their confidence in his judgment wavering. Edgar, the eldest and most respected among them, requested a private audience with Damien only 3 days after the gathering, his expression grave as he settled into the chair across from the young Alpha King. "You have made a costly decision," Edgar said without preamble, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. Alena Whitmore held this pack together in ways you perhaps never noticed because you never had to notice. Her absence would not go unfelt for long. Damien's jaw tightened. The decision was necessary. This pack needs an heir, and it needs strong alliances. An heir requires a mother who is present and willing, Edgar replied evenly. You have neither now, and from what I hear, the young woman standing beside you has ambitions that extend far beyond simply bearing children for this pack. Damien said nothing, though the words settled uncomfortably in his chest, a discomfort he refused to examine too closely. Over the following days, small signs of trouble began accumulating. Hunting parties returned with less game than usual, as though the forest itself had grown less generous. A minor territorial dispute with a neighboring pack, something Alena would have resolved through careful diplomacy, instead escalated into a tense standoff that required Damien's direct and forceful intervention, damaging relations that had taken years to build. Serafina, for her part, seemed largely unbothered by the growing unrest. She spent her days positioning herself prominently beside Damien during pack meetings, offering opinions on matters she had little experience with, subtly undermining Colin's authority whenever she found opportunity. She smiled warmly whenever elders were present and shifted into something colder and more calculating the moment she believed herself unobserved. Damien noticed none of this at first, too consumed by the mounting pressures of his position and an unease he could not quite name. But late one night, unable to sleep, he found himself standing in the empty room that had once belonged to Alena, staring at the space where her belongings had been, now bare and silent. He picked up the moonstone pendant from where it sat on a small table, the stone he had not been able to bring himself to lock away or discard. It remained dark and lifeless in his palm, nothing like the soft glow it had carried when Alena wore it against her skin. He thought about her hands, steady even as she unclasped the necklace in front of hundreds of witnesses. He thought about the absence of tears in her eyes, the quiet dignity in her voice when she had spoken those final words to him. Somewhere beneath the anger and pride that had driven his decision that night, a small, uncomfortable truth began to surface, one he was not yet ready to fully confront. He closed his hand around the pendant and set it back down, telling himself once again that he had made the right choice for his pack. But sleep did not come easily that night, nor for many nights after. It was Colin who first uncovered the truth, though he did not go looking for it deliberately. Weeks after Elena's departure, as tensions within the pack continued rising and Damien grew increasingly withdrawn and irritable, Colin found himself reviewing old healer records while searching for information related to a lingering illness affecting several younger pack members. The records, kept in a locked archive beneath the pack house, documented every major healing effort undertaken by the pack's healers over the past decade. Colin had not expected to find anything related to Alena. But buried among the entries from 2 winters prior, during the plague that had swept through Blackthorn territory and claimed the lives of nearly a dozen wolves before it was finally contained, he found a detailed account written in Margaret's careful handwriting, describing an emergency healing ritual performed to save the youngest and weakest members of the pack. The ritual had required an enormous transfer of strength, drawn directly from the life force of a willing wolf strong enough to survive the depletion. Margaret had recorded, with clinical precision, that Alena had volunteered without hesitation, insisting that her position as Luna meant she bore responsibility for protecting the most vulnerable among them. The record noted, in a smaller, almost hesitant addition beneath the main entry, that such a significant transfer of strength often permanently affected a wolf's ability to conceive, as the body redirected its deepest reserves toward healing and protection rather than new life. Colin sat frozen at the desk for a long moment, rereading the entry 3 times to make certain he understood its implications correctly. Alena had not failed to give Damien an heir because of any weakness or shortcoming. She had given up that possibility entirely, quietly and without complaint, in order to save the lives of children and elders who might otherwise have died during that terrible winter. She had never told Damien. She had never told anyone outside of Margaret and whichever other healers had assisted in the ritual. Colin closed the record carefully, his hands trembling slightly, and immediately sought out Damien. He found the Alpha King alone in his study, staring blankly at reports he had clearly not been reading, dark circles shadowing his eyes from weeks of restless nights. Colin did not waste time with pleasantries. "You need to see something," he said, placing the old record on the desk in front of Damien. "It concerns Alena." Damien's expression shifted from weary indifference to sharp attention the moment he heard her name. He read the entry slowly, his brow furrowing with confusion at first, then tightening with something far more painful as understanding dawned. He read it again. And a third time. When he finally looked up at Colin, his face had gone pale, his hands gripping the edges of the desk as though he needed something solid to hold on to. "She never told me," he said quietly, his voice hollow. "Would you have listened?" Colin asked, not unkindly, but firmly. "You had already decided she was failing you before you ever asked her why." The words struck Damien harder than any physical blow could have. He thought back to every conversation he'd had with Alena over those 2 years since the plague, every moment he had allowed frustration and pressure from the elders to build into resentment, every time he had noticed her growing quieter, more withdrawn, and had assumed it was simply her nature rather than the weight of a sacrifice she carried alone. He remembered nights when she had seemed exhausted beyond reason, and he had dismissed it as tiredness from her duties rather than asking deeper questions. He remembered the way she had flinched, almost imperceptibly, whenever conversations turned toward the topic of children, a flinch he had misread as guilt rather than grief. Shame settled over him like a physical weight, pressing down on his chest until he found it difficult to breathe properly. "I need to speak with Margaret directly," Damien said finally, standing abruptly. "I need to understand exactly what happened." Colin nodded but hesitated before Damien could leave the room. "There is something else you should know." Damien turned back, sensing from Colin's tone that whatever came next would not be easy to hear either. "Serafina has been meeting privately with several of the younger elders," Colin said carefully. "She has been suggesting that with Alena gone, the pack should consider restructuring succession entirely, placing less emphasis on bloodline and more on strategic alliances, meaning her own family's growing influence over Blackthorn affairs." Damien's jaw tightened. "Meaning she intends to secure her own position regardless of whether I choose her or not." "It would appear so," Colin confirmed. Damien said nothing for a long moment, processing the full weight of what he had learned within the span of a single conversation. The woman he had publicly humiliated had sacrificed her own future to protect his pack without ever seeking recognition or sympathy for that loss. Meanwhile, the woman he had considered elevating in her place had been quietly maneuvering for power from the very beginning, her affection for him nothing more than a calculated performance. He felt something inside him shift, hardening into a resolve entirely different from the one that had driven his cruel decision weeks earlier. That evening, Damien confronted Serafina directly, laying out precisely what Colin had discovered regarding her private meetings with the elders. Serafina's composed mask slipped for the first time since Damien had known her, revealing something colder and more calculating beneath the surface. "You would truly choose her over the future I could offer this pack?" Serafina asked, her voice sharp with disbelief and rising anger. "A woman who could not even give you an heir. She gave up the ability to have an heir saving children who would otherwise have died," Damien said, his voice low and controlled despite the fury building beneath his calm exterior. "She gave everything to this pack, quietly, without ever asking for recognition. You have spent every moment since arriving here scheming for a crown you never had any right to." Serafina's expression twisted with fury, but Damien did not allow her the opportunity to continue. He ordered her removed from Blackthorn territory that same night, stripping her of whatever standing she had begun accumulating among the pack, ignoring her protest and thinly veiled threats regarding her father's reaction. As guards escorted Serafina from the territory, Damien stood alone in the courtyard, the cold night air settling around him as heavily as the guilt now pressing against his chest. He looked up at the moon, bright and full above the pack house, and thought of Alena walking beneath that same moon weeks earlier, alone and humiliated because of his own blindness and pride. He knew apologizing would not undo what he had done. He knew words alone could never repair the damage caused by public humiliation delivered in front of hundreds of witnesses. But he also knew, standing there in the quiet aftermath of everything he had just learned, that he could not simply continue forward without at least attempting to make things right, regardless of whether Elena ever chose to forgive him. The following morning, Damien informed Colin and Edgar of his intention to travel to the Wildwood personally, without guards, without ceremony, stripped of every symbol of authority that had once made him feel untouchable. Edgar studied him carefully before nodding slowly. "It is a start," the elder said. "Whether it is enough remains entirely up to her." Damien understood this completely. He did not deserve forgiveness simply because he now recognized his mistake. But he intended, for the first time in longer than he could remember, to earn something rather than simply demand it through position or title. Damien arrived at the edge of the Wildwood just after dawn, his horse left behind at the territory border, choosing instead to travel the final distance on foot, exhausted and unshaven after 2 days of hard travel undertaken with barely any rest. He found the small cottage exactly where Colin's contacts had indicated, smoke curling gently from its chimney into the cool morning air. He stood at the edge of the small garden for a long moment, gathering whatever courage remained after the long journey, before finally approaching the door and knocking firmly. Margaret opened the door, her expression shifting immediately from mild curiosity to sharp recognition the moment she saw who stood before her. Her face hardened into something cold and unwelcoming. "You have no business here," she said flatly, moving to close the door. "Please," Damien said quickly, placing his hand gently against the wood, though he did not force his way inside. "I only wish to speak with her. I will not force anything. If she refuses, I will leave immediately." Margaret studied him carefully, her sharp eyes taking in the exhaustion evident in his posture, the humility in his tone that seemed entirely unlike the arrogant alpha king who had humiliated her niece weeks earlier. "She is healing," Margaret said finally. "I will not have you undo what little progress she has made." "I understand," Damien replied quietly. "I am not asking her to return with me. I am only asking for the chance to speak the truth I should have spoken weeks ago." Margaret hesitated, then closed the door firmly, leaving Damien standing alone outside in the cold morning air. He did not leave, despite the clear dismissal. He simply waited, his shoulders squared, prepared to remain for however long necessary. He returned the following day, and the day after that, each time greeted by Margaret's firm refusal, each time choosing to wait quietly nearby rather than force the issue or retreat entirely. On the third day, as he stood near the edge of the garden, watching the smoke rise steadily from the cottage chimney, the door finally opened, and Elena herself stepped outside. She looked different than he remembered, thinner, paler, but somehow also stronger, as though the weeks away from Blackthorn had stripped away something false and left something more genuine in its place. Her eyes, when they met his, held none of the warmth he remembered from their early years together, but neither did they hold the raw devastation from the night of the gathering. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice steady, guarded. Damien took a slow breath, forcing himself to meet her gaze directly rather than retreating into the authority and command that had defined so much of their relationship previously. "I know what you did during the plague," he said quietly. "I know what the healing ritual cost you." Colin found the records. "I read them myself." Something flickered across Elena's expression, surprise mixed with old, buried pain, though she said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "I should have asked you why," Damien continued, his voice rough with emotion he no longer attempted to hide. "I should have asked you what happened during those years instead of assuming the worst and blaming you for something that was never your fault. I let pressure from the elders and my own pride convince me that your worth was tied entirely to whether you could give me an heir, and I never once considered what you might have sacrificed already for this pack." Elena's arms wrapped tightly around herself, though her expression remained carefully composed. "You humiliated me in front of 5 packs, Damien. You did not simply fail to ask questions. You publicly declared that everything I had given you meant nothing." "I know," Damien said, his voice breaking slightly. "There is no excuse I can offer that makes that moment acceptable. I was cruel, and I was wrong, and I understand if you cannot forgive me for it." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the gentle rustling of wind through the surrounding trees. "Then why are you here?" Alena asked again, though her voice had softened slightly. Because I am not asking you to return as Luna, Damian said. I am not asking you to forgive me immediately, or even at all. I am asking for the chance to earn back whatever trust one destroyed, not as an alpha king demanding his queen return, but simply as a man who recognizes the depth of his mistake and wishes to prove, through actions rather than words, that he can become someone worthy of standing beside you again. Alena studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of the manipulation or pride that had defined so much of their final months together. She found, instead, genuine exhaustion, genuine remorse, and something she had not expected to see again, vulnerability entirely stripped of the armor he usually wore as Alpha King. I removed Seraphina from Blackthorn territory, Damian added quietly. She was never who I believed her to be. She was scheming for power from the very beginning, and I was too blind with my own frustrations to see it clearly. Alena absorbed this information silently, though something in her posture shifted slightly, a small easing of tension she had likely carried for weeks without fully realizing it. I am not the same person who left that hall, she said finally. I do not know if I can simply return to who I was before, even if I wanted to. I am not asking you to be the same person, Damian replied. I am asking for the chance to know whoever you have become, and to prove, slowly and honestly, that I am capable of becoming someone deserving of that chance. Alena remained quiet for a long moment, the cold morning wind stirring gently around them both. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but steady. You may return to Blackthorn, she said. I will not promise anything beyond that. I will not return with you now, and I will not agree to resume the position of Luna simply because you have realized your mistake. Damian nodded immediately, relief and continued uncertainty mixing together in his expression. I understand completely. I am not asking for guarantees. I am only asking for the opportunity to try. Alena studied him a moment longer before turning back toward the cottage, though she paused at the door, looking back at him one final time. Prove it through actions, Damian, she said quietly. Not through words alone. Words were never the problem between us. It was always what you failed to notice, and what you failed to do. With that, she disappeared back inside the cottage, leaving Damian standing alone in the cold morning air, uncertain of what precisely came next, but resolved, more firmly than he had ever been about anything in his life, to earn back what his pride and blindness had cost him. He returned to Blackthorn that same day, carrying with him not the satisfaction of resolution, but the quiet, difficult understanding that real change would require far more than a single conversation or a single apology. It would require patience, consistency, and humility sustained over weeks and months, with no guarantee of the outcome he hoped for. For the first time since becoming Alpha King, Damian found himself willing to accept that uncertainty completely. 3 months passed slowly, marked by small, careful changes within the Blackthorn pack that gradually rippled outward into something resembling genuine transformation. Damian began by publicly acknowledging his mistake before the full pack council, a gathering that included representatives from the same 5 packs who had witnessed Elena's humiliation months earlier. He did not offer excuses or attempt to soften the reality of what he had done. He simply stated, plainly and without pride, that he had wronged his Luna through cruelty born of his own weakness and blindness, and that regardless of what came next in his personal life, the pack deserved to know that such behavior would never again be tolerated from its leadership. The announcement sent ripples of surprise through the gathered representatives, though Edgar's expression carried quiet approval as Damian spoke. Colin, standing nearby, offered a small, encouraging nod when Damian's eyes briefly sought reassurance. Word of the announcement spread quickly beyond Blackthorn territory, eventually reaching Alena through Margaret, who maintained careful, occasional contact with trusted friends still living within pack borders. Alena said nothing when she heard the news, though something in her expression suggested she had not expected such a public acknowledgement from the same man who had once used a public gathering to tear her down. Damian did not attempt to visit Alena again during those initial months, respecting the space she had requested, though he sent no messages demanding her return, no gifts intended to manipulate her emotions, nothing that might suggest impatience or entitlement regarding her eventual decision. Instead, he focused entirely on rebuilding the pack's stability and repairing the damage his earlier decisions had caused. He worked closely with Colin to address the accumulated tensions that had built during Elena's absence, personally mediating disputes rather than leaving such responsibilities entirely to others. He visited families who had lost loved ones during the plague years earlier, listening to their stories, acknowledging publicly the sacrifices made by healers and volunteers whose contributions had gone largely unrecognized, including, though he never named her directly out of respect for her privacy, the sacrifice made by his own Luna. Slowly, the park's internal stability began improving. Hunting parties returned with steadier success. Territorial disputes with neighboring parks eased as Damien approached negotiations with newfound patience rather than the impulsive pride that had once characterized his leadership. Elders who had grown wary of his judgment began expressing cautious confidence once again, watching his sustained efforts with something approaching genuine respect rather than simple obligation toward his position. Meanwhile, in the wildwood, Alena continued her quiet work alongside her aunt, gradually expanding her responsibilities as her strength and confidence returned. She began treating patients from neighboring neutral territories who sought Margaret's renowned healing expertise, her own skills sharpening steadily with practice. The work brought her a sense of purpose entirely separate from her former role as Luna, a purpose built on her own abilities rather than her position beside a powerful Alpha King. She thought of Damien often during those months, though she carefully guarded against allowing those thoughts to soften into premature forgiveness. She remembered the humiliation too clearly, the cold satisfaction on Seraphina's face, the silence of hundreds of witnesses who had watched her dignity stripped away in a matter of moments. Yet she also could not deny the reports reaching her through Margaret's careful updates, reports suggesting genuine, sustained change rather than temporary performance intended to win her back. Nearly 4 months after their conversation outside the cottage, Alena received word that a serious illness had begun spreading among children in a small neutral village bordering Blackthorn territory, an illness Margaret recognized immediately as similar to the plague that had swept through years earlier. Without hesitation, Alena volunteered to travel to the village alongside her aunt, understanding the risks fully but unwilling to withhold her skills from children in desperate need. When word reached Damien that Alena had traveled into a territory bordering his own to assist with the outbreak, he immediately offered pack resources, medical supplies, and additional healers to support the effort, though he did not travel there himself, respecting the boundaries Alena had established months earlier. He simply ensured that everything within his power to provide reached the village swiftly and without any expectation of recognition or gratitude directed toward himself. The outbreak was contained within 2 weeks, thanks largely to the combined efforts of Alena, Margaret, and the additional resources Damien had quietly provided. As Alena finally returned to the wildwood, exhausted but satisfied with the successful containment, she found herself reflecting more deeply on the changes she had witnessed in Damien over recent months, changes that appeared consistent regardless of whether she was present to witness them directly. Shortly after her return, Damien requested, through calling rather than directly, the opportunity to speak with her once more. Alena considered the request carefully before finally agreeing, curious despite herself about what several months of genuine effort had produced in the man who had once shattered her dignity so thoroughly. They met at the border between Blackthorn territory and the wildwood, a neutral space chosen deliberately by Damien to ensure Alena felt no pressure or obligation regarding the conversation. He arrived alone once again, though this time his posture carried less desperation and more quiet, steady resolve. "I am not here to ask you to return as Luna," he said immediately, before Alena could ask the question herself. "I understand that decision remains entirely yours, regardless of anything I have done over these past months." Alena studied him carefully, noting the genuine calm in his expression, so different from the anxious desperation that had characterized their previous conversation months earlier. "Then why did you ask to see me?" she asked. "Because I wanted you to know, directly from me rather than through reports passed along by others, that the changes within the park are not temporary measures intended to win you back," Damien said. "I have come to understand, through months of reflection and through watching the consequences of my own previous blindness, that leadership without humility becomes exactly the kind of cruelty I display toward you. Whether or not you ever choose to return, I intend to remain the leader I have become over these past months, because it is who I should have been from the beginning." Alena remained quiet for a long moment, processing his words carefully, searching for any hint of manipulation or performance, finding instead only steady sincerity. "The park has been improving," she said finally. "I have heard reports." "They have," Damien confirmed. "Though I did not undertake those changes for the sake of reports reaching you. I undertook them because they were necessary, and because I finally understood what true leadership requires. Something in Elena's expression softened slightly, though she remained cautious, unwilling to rush toward forgiveness simply because months had passed without incident. I am not ready to return as Luna, she said carefully. I do not know if I ever will be, fully, in the way things existed before. I understand, Damien said, and his tone suggested he genuinely did, without the desperation or disappointment that might have colored such a response months earlier. But, Elena continued, watching his expression carefully, I would be willing to continue speaking with you, gradually, without expectation of any particular outcome, simply to understand who you have become, separate from who you once were. Relief and cautious hope flickered across Damien's face, though he carefully restrained himself from appearing overly eager. I would welcome that, he said simply. Whatever pace you require. Over the following weeks, their conversations continued, slowly, carefully, each meeting held in neutral spaces at Elena's discretion rather than Damien's convenience. They spoke of the park's ongoing recovery, of Elena's growing healing work, of the quiet, difficult process of rebuilding trust that had been so thoroughly shattered months earlier. Damien listened more than he spoke, asking genuine questions about Elena's experiences and perspectives rather than assuming he already understood her needs or feelings. Gradually, cautious respect began evolving into something resembling companionship, though Elena remained careful to guard against rushing toward reconciliation before she felt genuinely secure in Damien's transformation. She noticed, with quiet relief, that he no longer deferred automatically to pressure from elders regarding park decisions, that he actively sought balanced counsel rather than impulsive certainty, that he treated Colin and other park members with a patience and respect that had been notably absent during the earlier years of his leadership. Nearly 7 months after the night of her humiliation, as the next Great Moon ceremony approached, a ceremony traditionally attended by representatives from the same 5 parks who had witnessed her departure, Elena received an invitation from Damien, delivered personally rather than through intermediaries. The invitation did not demand her attendance. It did not assume her forgiveness or her return. It simply requested her presence, should she choose to attend, without any specific expectation attached to the request itself. Elena considered the invitation carefully over several days, discussing the decision at length with Margaret, who offered no direct guidance but reminded her niece gently that whatever choice she made should come entirely from her own sense of readiness rather than obligation toward anyone else's timeline or expectations. Finally, Elena decided to attend, though she made the decision entirely on her own terms, arriving quietly rather than with any grand announcement, taking a place among the gathered park members rather than beside Damien at the ceremonial platform. The ceremony proceeded much as such gatherings traditionally did, with representatives from each park offering blessings beneath the full moon, elders speaking of unity and strength, younger wolves participating in traditional dances meant to honor the moon's ancient connection to their kind. Elena watched quietly from among the crowd, noting the genuine warmth with which park members greeted Damien, warmth that felt earned rather than simply commanded through his position. As the ceremony neared its conclusion, Damien stepped forward once more, though this time his expression carried none of the cold authority that had defined his previous public address regarding Elena. Instead, he addressed the gathered crowd with quiet humility, acknowledging openly, before all 5 parks who had witnessed his previous cruelty, the depth of the mistake he had made months earlier. Many of you witnessed a moment of great cruelty in this very territory, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent crowd. I stood before you and humiliated the very Luna who had sacrificed more for this park than I understood at the time. I will not ask forgiveness through empty words alone. I have spent these past months attempting to demonstrate, through action rather than promise, that I understand the depth of my failure and my commitment to becoming a leader worthy of this position. The crowd remained silent, though several elders nodded slowly, clearly recognizing the sincerity behind his words given the visible changes within the park over recent months. Damien then reached into his cloak and withdrew the moonstone pendant, the same pendant Elena had returned to him months earlier, still dark and lifeless without her presence to activate its ancient magic. I do not offer this again as a symbol of ownership or obligation, he said, his eyes finding Elena among the crowd for the first time since the ceremony began. I offer it only as a symbol of the partnership I hope, in time, we might rebuild together, should you choose that path, at whatever pace feels right to you. He did not approach her directly, respecting the boundaries they had carefully established over recent months. He simply held the pendant visible before the gathered crowd, waiting, without demand or expectation, for whatever response Alena chose to offer. The crowd's attention shifted entirely toward Alena, though she felt no pressure from their collective gaze, focused instead entirely on the quiet sincerity in Damien's expression, the genuine transformation she had witnessed over months of careful, patient rebuilding. She stepped forward slowly, the crowd parting quietly to allow her passage, until she stood before Damien beneath the bright, full moon that had witnessed both her humiliation and this quiet moment of potential renewal. "I do not return because I need the crown," she said softly, her voice carrying just far enough for those nearby to hear clearly. "I return because I have finally seen, through months of consistent action rather than empty promises, the man beneath that crown, and I believe that man is someone I can choose to stand beside again." She reached out and took the pendant from his hand, and as her fingers closed around the cool stone, it began glowing softly once more, its ancient light returning exactly as it had the night Damien first placed it around her neck years earlier. Damien's expression shifted into something Alena had not seen from him in a very long time, genuine, unguarded relief and gratitude, entirely free from pride or entitlement. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion he no longer attempted to hide. "Not for returning, but for allowing me the chance to prove myself worthy of that possibility." Alena fastened the pendant back around her neck herself, a quiet, deliberate choice rather than allowing him to place it there as he once had. The gesture carried its own significance, a reminder that whatever partnership they built moving forward would be one of equal choice rather than simple tradition or obligation. As the moon ceremony concluded and the gathered Pax began quiet celebrations honoring the renewed bond between their Alpha King and his Luna, Alena felt, for the first time in many months, a genuine sense of peace settling over her, not because everything had been perfectly resolved, but because she had finally reclaimed her own agency within a relationship that had once stripped it away entirely. The road ahead would require continued patience and continued effort from them both, she understood that clearly. But standing there beneath the bright moon, surrounded by a pack that had witnessed both her lowest and highest moments, Alena felt genuinely hopeful for the first time since that terrible night months earlier, when a single cruel decision had nearly cost them everything they had built together. Damien reached for her hand gently, and this time, Alena chose, freely and without hesitation, to take it.